Hi, welcome to this training. We're going to talk about 5 different ways to get your students talking and understanding. First, a quick introduction. My name is Mara Rogers. I'm a speech-language pathologist at Northeast Metro 916. I work with students primarily who are nonverbal and have autism or other developmental disabilities and use communication devices to communicate.
Hi, I'm Sarah Vermilia. I'm also a speech-language pathologist at Northeast Metro 916. I work with a variety of students across the autism spectrum, as well as students with emotional behavior disorders and all types of different language disorders. All right, so we have a few different learning outcomes for today. We are trying to provide staff with ways to consider students' language disorders or language difficulties, so thinking about what they look like. We're going to provide thinking points for those who work with any student in special education, and the bulk of our presentation will be providing strategies to use in the classroom in order to support both expressive and receptive language.
So to start off with, what does a language disorder look like? Often a language disorder might look like noncompliance, so your student might not be following directions accurately. They might need a lot of prompting to follow instructions. They might get upset when they're given directions. They might say no a lot. This might look like noncompliance, but often for a lot of our students in special education, it's actually signs of a language disorder because they're actually just not understanding what they're supposed to be doing. Another thing it might look like is a student following part of a direction, but then maybe getting lost or asking lots of questions, or not following through with what they're asked to do. Again, because they probably don't understand what they're supposed to be doing. Students with language disorders also might require lots of different prompts to have conversations with peers or adults, to respond to questions, to ask for help. This is really hard for a lot of our students, to describe items. This can be in their writing or verbally, to tell different stories, to retell stories. So there are lots of different ways this can look with how a student talks. Kind of our goal for every student who has a language disorder is twofold. We want them to have SNUG, which is called spontaneous novel utterance generation. That means that they're saying things that they think of, and it's easy for them to say what they're thinking, and they don't need adults to help them make sentences and talk. We also want our students to be understanding and processing information as independently as possible. And this is across all different environments. So we want them to be understanding and processing at home, at school, in the community, and with a variety of different people.
All right, so here's kind of our schedule for today. We have our 5 ways to get your students talking and understanding. So we're going to go through 5 different topics. The first one is wait time. The second one is visual supports. The third one is use simple sentences. The fourth one is repeat / reflect and expand. And the last one is communicating across environments. So Mara's going to start by talking about wait time.
So the first strategy we're going to talk about is wait time. I'm sure everyone has heard someone tell them they need to wait longer for your students to respond. So the first thing to keep in mind is that the average student takes 1 to 10 seconds to respond. So this is just a typical student in a regular education classroom. They need 1 to 10 seconds to respond to a question. So there are different types of questions they might be asked, and kind of the types of questions that students are asked, it takes longer or shorter for them to respond appropriately. So for recall questions, so something that they just kind of know, it can be 1 to 3 seconds. For questions that require calculation, so something you need to think about, that can take 4 to 6 seconds. And higher order questions that require more thought than simple recall. So, you know, maybe a why question or a what do you think question could take up to 6 to 10 seconds. Again, this is for a typical student. So for the average student with a disability or a language impairment, this could be anything more than 10 seconds. There are lots of individual factors to consider with our students who have language impairments. Are they using a different mode of communication? You know, does your student have to find it on their AAC device in order to respond? That's going to make it take a lot longer for the student to respond to whatever you're asking them to do. Some strategies to help make sure you're waiting long enough is to count to 10 in your head before saying anything to your student or giving them another prompt. So this is something I do. It's kind of awkward, but just counting to 10 can be really a super simple way to make sure you're giving your student enough time to respond to what you're asking. If you're in a classroom that has a clock, just watch the clock. Make sure the little second hand goes 10 to 15 seconds before you say anything additional to your student. I know some people do things like say hippopotamus three times before giving another command or saying something else to your student. So something that's important to think about when you're thinking about wait time is that wait time includes between people. So if you give the student a direction, that means that the person sitting next to you or the classroom teacher, you should be waiting 10 seconds before that next person says something. So we don't want to get into this habit where we're like rapid firing questions or directions at students, because they need up to 10, 20 seconds to process even that first thing that you said to them. Something that I was taught for thinking about wait time is wait until it's awkward before you reprompt. It's gonna feel uncomfortable to wait long enough, but you'll be surprised by how much your students can do independently when you give them that time to accurately process and think and respond to whatever you're asking for them.
All right, so the next strategy or support that we're talking about is, of course, visual supports. This is something that I'm sure a lot of you are pretty familiar with, especially if you work with students with autism, but I really want you to kind of think about visuals in this way as a way to support all students. Visuals really include anything from pictures, picture symbols, it could be written words, it can look like checklists, it can look like task lists, things could be numbered, etc. It's really anything that you can see can be considered a visual support. So thinking about doing even just little modifications like pairing what you're saying with something visual. So writing directions on the board, the same directions that you're maybe giving verbally, just also write them down on the board. You could write your schedule out, whether that's like a daily schedule or kind of a schedule within a schedule. For example, during a lesson, you might write out, okay, first we're going to check in, and then we're going to do some writing, and then we're going to do an activity. Making sure that you write that out somewhere. Of course, you can also have a posted daily schedule like what you see in the picture here. All of these types of visual supports really help support receptive language or understanding of language. And like I said before, that's really something that supports all students, whether they have autism or other disabilities, any students with a language disorder. This is going to be extremely beneficial for kind of a rule of thumb that I use and also hear my colleagues use is that if you find yourself saying something more than once, whether it's you say the same thing every day or you're saying the same thing repeatedly, that's probably a good time to use a visual or a good opportunity to use a visual. Your verbals can be easily replaced by just putting a visual in there. So if you think about offering your student as much independence as possible, if that student is always relying on you, for example, in the morning they come in and every day you have to tell them verbally, okay, take your coat off and put your backpack in your locker. That student is relying on you as an adult to give them that directive every single day, and that's really hard to fade yourself away and give them that independence if you verbally have to say that. And so if you just think about putting in a visual somewhere that that student can access, that gives them independence in their sort of morning routine when they walk in the door. So just some more thoughts on visual support. So really looking at classroom visuals and how your classroom is set up. So Sarah Ward is an excellent resource. She is also a speech language pathologist, but she sort of specializes in executive functioning. I would highly recommend attending one of her conferences if you're able to. She talks a lot about different uses of visuals, but also the idea of setting up your classroom in a certain way. So she talks about zoning your classroom. So that's thinking about creating little areas within your classroom that are meant for specific types of tasks or categories. So for example, you might have a math zone, and that's where you would have maybe like your number line, other math tools, other math related things posted. You might have a little homework zone, and that might be where students can either get their homework, or that maybe that's where they turn their homework in. It's all kind of in the same place, etc. So that's a really easy way to support students' executive functioning skills by just making the classroom zoned in that sort of way, so it's easy for them to access. Oh, we're thinking about reading, so that means I'm going to go over here to the reading corner. Another thought I was going to mention was that visuals are really important, and they're great to have around the classroom, but making sure that your visuals are all meaningful and organized and meant for a purpose, and not just having extra visuals up for the sake of just making something look exciting or entertaining. That kind of stuff can create sort of like visual clutter, or visual noise is what Sarah Ward calls it. So it is best to keep things up for a purpose. And she also talks about keeping certain spaces in your classroom blank or empty, so that there are places of like sort of visual quiet. So sort of the opposite of that. So yeah, just some more thoughts on visual supports within your classroom.
Our next strategy that we're going to talk about is using simple sentences. So this visual is a nice way to describe this fancy thing called the zone of proximal development. So we know how and what a child can communicate or understand independently. So when we're working with our students, we want to be working at the zone of proximal development. So kind of one step above how and what a child can communicate with help. We kind of want to try and avoid how and what a child can't communicate even with help. So this goes for both their comprehension and their expressive language. Right now, we're just going to talk about what they're comprehending. So we want to be speaking to our students about 2 or 3 words above where their understanding is. So if our students are consistently understanding 1-step directions, we could be providing them 2-step directions plus some sort of support, so that they can learn that higher level of comprehension of a task. Something that's important to support our students' comprehension that we've already talked about is including visuals. So making sure that when you're giving your student tasks or things that they need to comprehend, if it's a more complex task or comprehension, that we're including a visual support so that the student can do it independently. The last thing is, when we're talking about students' comprehension, we want to make sure we're explicitly telling them what they should be doing. So that means we can tell them, sit in your chair, not something like, it's time to be like, I can't even think of an example. We want to tell them what we want them to do. Sit in your chair, not don't stand up at your desk. Mm-hmm. So again, it's important that we're using simple sentences so students are understanding what we want them to do.
Yeah, so just as a side note, thinking about the receptive language piece, something that we notice and that we know about our dialect in Minnesota is that we tend to use sort of soft language, or add in sort of like more social niceties than what we need to. So for example, like Mara was saying, if the direction is like sit or sit down, it might be normal for someone to say like, oh, do you think you could sit down? Come here and sit down, please. And adding some more of sort of that fluffy, nice language. Sometimes using direct and clear language can sound sort of harsh or overly direct, especially for us from the Midwest or Minnesota. And so it's important to think about that and just acknowledge like you are doing what's expected, even if it feels socially odd at times. This is more of what our students need in order to understand and comprehend what we're saying. So you are still being nice, just not in the classic Minnesota way. So again, continuing to talk about that zone of proximal development, just thinking of more of that expressive side of things. So what the student is producing or expressing. So it's a similar idea of how we want to take what they are doing and then simply expand on that. So thinking about what words the student's currently using or what types of words a student is using. So you could, even just as a simple kind of rule of thumb, you add 1 to 2 words to what the student's currently saying. So for example, a student might say goldfish, and the staff know that they are basically requesting goldfish. You could reflect back to them and add and say, I want goldfish. Let me go get you some goldfish. Another thing to think about is, was what the student said grammatically correct? So this is something I notice a lot, that people get familiar with a student's sort of speech and language patterns and they stop correcting or modeling the accurate use. And so if you think about, if a student says something that's not grammatically correct, think about repeating it back using the full grammatical sentence. So for example, a student asks the question, what you feel? That's obviously not a grammatically correct sentence. So the staff can reflect back, how do you feel? I feel tired, and also answer the question. These principles apply for both verbal and nonverbal students. So thinking about just using whatever modality of communication that student uses. So if they are verbal, thinking about adding, as in our examples, adding that 1 to 2 words above where they're at. If a student uses a communication device, think about combining 1 to 2 more buttons than what the student is doing.
So we're going to watch a quick video that nicely shows how a teacher expands upon what the student is doing using both their communication device and their voice.
Oh, we do it like this.
Delicious.
Look.
Crunchy.
Delicious crunchy almonds.
Almonds.
Delicious crunchy almonds. Yum. Aww.
You know how to get to my heart. Talk about almonds.
So that instructor did a really nice job. She heard the student say something like almonds, or noticed that he was eating almonds, and she used his communication device to expand upon that word almonds by saying delicious, crunchy. And then when the student verbally said back to her, like crunchy almonds, she expanded it even more by adding the word yum to the end of it. So she did a really nice job of listening to what the student was doing and then meeting him and expanding what he was doing by talking one step above where he was.
All right, so our last topic that we wanted to talk on is communicating across environments. So how much a student understands and talks can really vary across different environments. So it depends on, we kind of have 2 different environments if you think about internal states versus external environments. So internal states basically means the way that you're feeling or the way that your body is in terms of being regulated or dysregulated. So turns out this is the same as any other skill, where it's much harder to access your skills when you're upset or dysregulated. So that's important to keep in mind with our students. Just because our students have skills in one area, or potentially when they're calm, maybe they can communicate pretty well, but as soon as they're becoming dysregulated, they can't always access those same skills. And then also thinking about external environments. So that's looking at the people that they're interacting with, and also the physical space or the environment, the place that they're in. Those things can also impact their ability to understand and communicate clearly. So this is a good thing to think about. I always ask my staff and other people that work with the student in terms of thinking about people and places. When your student says something or communicates something, think about if that student were communicating that to a stranger, would the stranger be able to understand them? Would they be able to know what they were asking? So that's a really good sort of thing to be thinking in your head, just because you know the student well and you're anticipating maybe their wants and needs. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're communicating effectively, and it doesn't mean that they would be able to communicate across different people or across different environments. So just thinking about this skill, again, this is a really good place where visual supports can also help. This is a really nice visual support. We call it a I'm too upset to talk board. And so this is a board that we or a visual that we give to a lot of the students, especially to use when they're becoming upset or shutting down or whatever their sort of behavior might look like outwardly. This is a really easy way for them to just point to something to communicate sort of how they're feeling or maybe why they're getting upset, whether it's they don't understand, maybe something hurts, maybe they're feeling hungry or thirsty, or someone hurt their feelings. All of those kind of complex internal and external things that might be happening. This board is a really nice way to supplement that and give them another tool. Again, thinking about sort of that green zone of proximal development, and allows them to communicate even when it's a little bit harder to access their skills.
So that was all 5 of our strategies that you get to use to get your students talking and understanding. I'm just going to recap them quickly. The first strategy we talked about was wait time. Remember, wait until it's awkward. You want to give your students enough time to respond and to process and respond to whatever you're saying. The second strategy was using visual supports. So if you find yourself saying something more than once, chances are you need a visual. Visual supports help both our students' comprehension of what is being said to them, and it can also help them express themselves. The third strategy is to use simple sentences. No more Minnesota nice. Be direct with your students so that they understand what is expected of them. The fourth strategy is repeat or reflect and expand. So again, thinking about whatever your student's doing to respond back to them kind of at one step above where they're at. So we're working on always increasing what our students can say and who they can say it to. The last strategy is to keep in mind is when you're communicating across environments, students' skills might look super different. So if they're upset, it's going to be really hard for them to understand what you're telling them and also to communicate their wants and needs to you. So these are the 5 ways to get your students talking and understanding. Thank you all for listening to our presentation. If you have any questions, you can always send an email to one of us, or that's about it. I guess we have our emails on here. I could add them to the information. Thanks.
Thanks.